My mom threw away my grandfather's tool collection, saying, "You'll never build anything anyway. It's just taking up space." I didn't argue. 6 months later, she begged me to fix her kitchen cabinets. I just smiled and said, "Sorry. Those skills were just taking up space in my memory tuda." I, 24M, never thought a pile of rusty tools could change my entire relationship with my mother, but here we are. 6 months ago, she made a decision that cut deeper than any saw blade in my grandfather's collection. Today, I'm sitting in my apartment, listening to her voicemails pile up, and I can't help but smile. My grandfather died when I was 16. He was the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands: broken chairs, leaky faucets, wounded hearts. His garage was a shrine to craftsmanship, filled with tools that had stories etched into their worn handles. Hand planes that had smoothed countless pieces of wood, chisels that had carved intricate details, and a workbench scarred by decades of projects. When he passed, those tools became mine. Mom never understood the connection. She'd walk through the garage and see clutter where I saw possibility. She'd complain about the space they took up in our basement after I moved back home during college. But she tolerated it because Dad understood. He'd worked alongside my grandfather on weekend projects, and he knew what those tools meant to our family. Everything changed when Dad had his heart attack last year. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, but the real grief hit later when Mom started her purge. She attacked the house like she was erasing memories, donating clothes, throwing away papers, and systematically removing every trace of the life she'd built with Dad. I was at work when she got to the basement. I came home to find the garage door open and a truck from the local scrap yard backing out of our driveway. My stomach dropped before my brain could process what I was seeing. I ran to the basement, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly empty space where my grandfather's workbench used to stand. Mom was upstairs in the kitchen, washing dishes like nothing had happened. When I asked her where the tools were, she didn't even turn around. She told me she'd had them hauled away because I'd never build anything anyway, and they were just taking up space. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. I stood there for a moment, processing her words. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand she call the scrap yard and get everything back. But something in her tone stopped me. There was a finality to it, a dismissiveness that told me arguing would be pointless. So I didn't argue. I just nodded and went to my room. That night, I lay in bed thinking about my grandfather's hands guiding mine as we worked on projects together. I remembered the weight of his favorite hammer, the way his measuring tape would snap back with a satisfying click, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that clung to everything in his garage. All of it was gone, reduced to scrap metal because my mother couldn't see past her own grief. I moved out 2 weeks later, found a small apartment across town, and started rebuilding my life without her constant reminders that I was somehow inadequate. The first few months were rough. I'd catch myself reaching for tools that weren't there, planning projects I couldn't complete. But slowly, I started replacing what I'd lost. I couldn't afford the vintage quality of my grandfather's collection, but I began accumulating the basics. A decent drill, a circular saw, some hand tools. I started small, fixing a wobbly table for my neighbor, building shelves for my apartment. Each project felt like a small victory, a way of honoring the skills my grandfather had taught me. The irony wasn't lost on me when Mom started calling about her kitchen cabinets. It began with casual mentions during our weekly phone calls. She'd complain about how the doors wouldn't close properly, how the hinges were loose, how the whole kitchen looked shabby. I'd make non-committal sounds and change the subject. But the complaints became more frequent and more pointed. She started asking if I knew any handymen, if I had recommendations for contractors. I told her I didn't know anyone reliable in her area, which was technically true. I knew plenty of people who could fix her cabinets, but I wasn't about to recommend them. The first direct request came on a Tuesday evening. Mom called while I was working on a bookshelf for my living room, and she asked if I could come over the weekend to look at her kitchen. She mentioned that the cabinet doors were getting worse, and she was worried about the cost of hiring someone professional. I told her I was busy that weekend. She asked about the following weekend. I told her I had plans. This dance continued for 3 weeks until she finally asked me directly if I would fix her cabinets for her. I set down my sandpaper and really listened to her voice. There was something different in her tone, a vulnerability I hadn't heard since Dad's funeral. She was asking for help, something she rarely did. For a moment, I almost said yes. Almost offered to drive over and assess the damage, to spend a weekend fixing what was broken. But then I remembered the empty basement. I remembered her dismissive voice telling me I'd never build anything anyway. I remembered the sound of that truck driving away with my grandfather's legacy. I told her I couldn't help her. When she asked why, I explained that I didn't have the right tools anymore. She seemed confused, asking what I meant. So I reminded her about the day she'd thrown away my grandfather's collection. I told her that along with those tools, I'd apparently lost all my skills too. After all, she'd been right. I'd never build anything anyway. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. She asked if I was being serious, if I was really refusing to help her because of some old tools. I told her they weren't just old tools. They were my connection to my grandfather, my link to a tradition of craftsmanship that had been passed down through generations. They were the foundation of skills I'd spent years developing, skills she'd dismissed as worthless. She started to argue, to explain that she'd been overwhelmed after Dad's death, that she hadn't been thinking clearly. But I cut her off. I told her I understood grief, but I didn't understand cruelty. Throwing away those tools hadn't been about cleaning house. It had been about erasing a part of me she'd never valued. The conversation ended with her hanging up. I went back to my bookshelf, but my hands were shaking too much to continue working. I'd finally said what I'd been thinking for months, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd expected. Update 1. The calls started coming more frequently after that. Mom would leave voicemails describing the worsening state of her kitchen, the quotes she was getting from contractors, the financial strain of hiring professionals. She'd mention how much money she could save if I would just help her, how it would only take a weekend to fix everything. I listened to each message but didn't respond. Part of me felt guilty. She was my mother, and she was struggling. But a larger part of me felt vindicated. She was finally experiencing the consequences of her actions, finally understanding the value of skills she'd dismissed. 3 weeks after our phone conversation, she showed up at my apartment. I wasn't expecting her, and when I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. She'd lost weight since Dad's death, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside to let her pass. She looked around my apartment, taking in the handmade shelves, the refinished furniture, the small projects I'd completed. I watched her face as she realized what she was seeing, evidence that I could, in fact, build things. She sat on my couch and started talking. She told me about the contractor quotes, about how expensive it would be to fix her kitchen properly. She mentioned that she was on a fixed income now, that money was tighter than she'd expected. She asked again if I would help her, if we could work something out. I sat across from her and really looked at my mother. She was 62 years old, widowed, and struggling to maintain a house that had been designed for 2 people. Her kitchen cabinets were probably a legitimate safety hazard by now, and she couldn't afford to fix them properly. But I also saw the woman who had dismissed my skills, who had thrown away my inheritance without a second thought, who had reduced my grandfather's legacy to scrap metal. I saw someone who had never valued what I could do until she needed it herself. I told her I couldn't help her. When she asked why, I explained that my skills were apparently just taking up space in my memory, just like those tools had been taking up space in her basement. I suggested she call one of the contractors who'd given her quotes. She started crying then, quietly at first, then with the kind of deep sobs that come from months of suppressed grief. She told me she was sorry, that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she'd been so overwhelmed after Dad's death that she hadn't been thinking clearly. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay and that I'd help her fix her kitchen. But I couldn't. The hurt was too deep, the dismissal too complete. She hadn't just thrown away tools. She'd thrown away respect, validation, and connection. I handed her a tissue and told her I understood she was grieving. But I also told her that grief didn't excuse cruelty, and throwing away my grandfather's tools had been cruel. I explained that she'd made a choice that day, a choice that told me exactly how much she valued my skills and my connection to my grandfather. She left without saying goodbye. I watched from my window as she sat in her car for 10 minutes before driving away. I felt hollow, like I'd won a battle I'd never wanted to fight. Update 2. 2 months passed without contact. I threw myself into projects, building a dining table, refinishing a vintage dresser I'd found at a thrift store, creating a small workshop in my apartment's spare bedroom. Each completed project felt like a small act of rebellion, proof that I could indeed build things. My aunt called me on a Thursday evening. She was Mom's sister, and she'd always been the mediator in family conflicts. She told me that Mom's kitchen situation had gotten worse, that one of the cabinet doors had actually fallen off its hinges and nearly hit her. She asked if I knew what had happened between Mom and me, why we weren't talking. I explained the situation, starting with my grandfather's tools and ending with Mom's visit to my apartment. My aunt listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She told me she remembered my grandfather's workshop, how proud he'd been of his tools, and how excited he'd been to pass them on to me. She also told me she'd tried to talk Mom out of throwing them away, but Mom had been determined to clear out everything that reminded her of the past. I asked her why she was calling, what she wanted me to do. She said she wasn't asking me to forgive Mom or to fix her kitchen. She just wanted me to understand that Mom was struggling more than she was letting on, that the house was becoming too much for her to maintain alone. After we hung up, I sat in my workshop and thought about my grandfather. He'd been a patient man, slow to anger and quick to forgive. He'd taught me that building things required both strength and gentleness, that the best craftsmen knew when to apply pressure and when to ease up. But he'd also taught me that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. Some damage was too extensive, some trust too shattered. I wondered what he would think of this situation, whether he'd want me to help Mom or to stand my ground. I decided to drive by her house the next evening. I didn't plan to stop or to talk to her. I just wanted to see the place where I'd grown up, to remember what it had been like when Dad was alive and the basement was full of tools. The house looked smaller than I remembered and older. The paint was peeling on the front porch, and the lawn needed attention. I could see into the kitchen window from the street, and even from that distance, I could tell the cabinets were in rough shape. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the house and thinking about the family that had lived there. We'd been happy once, before grief and stubbornness had driven us apart. I thought about Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, about the way Mom used to brag about my school projects to her friends. But I also thought about the empty basement and the dismissive tone in her voice. I thought about months of phone calls where she'd never once apologized for what she'd done, only for how it had affected her. I thought about the way she'd only valued my skills when she needed them. I drove home without stopping. Update 3. The resolution came 6 months later, in a way I hadn't expected. My aunt called again, this time with news that Mom had fallen in her kitchen. She'd been trying to fix one of the loose cabinet doors herself when it had come completely off its hinges. She'd lost her balance trying to catch it and had ended up in the emergency room with a sprained wrist and bruised ribs. I felt a stab of guilt and concern. Despite everything that had happened between us, she was still my mother. I asked my aunt if she was okay, if she needed anything. My aunt told me Mom was fine physically, but the incident had shaken her. She'd realized how dangerous her kitchen had become, how her stubbornness was putting her at risk. My aunt asked if I would consider visiting Mom, not to fix her kitchen, but just to talk. She said Mom had been doing a lot of thinking since her fall, and she wanted to have a conversation with me. I agreed to visit, but I made it clear that I wasn't promising anything beyond a conversation. I drove to Mom's house on a Saturday morning, my stomach tight with anxiety. I hadn't been inside since the day I discovered the missing tools. Mom answered the door with her wrist in a brace. She looked older, more fragile than she had during her visit to my apartment. She invited me in, and I followed her to the kitchen. The cabinet situation was worse than I'd imagined. Several doors hung at odd angles, and I could see where she'd tried to make temporary repairs with duct tape and wire. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid. She started talking, and for the first time in months, she didn't mention her cabinets or ask for my help. Instead, she talked about Dad, about how lost she'd felt after his death, about how she'd been trying to erase the pain by erasing the memories. She told me she'd realized that throwing away my grandfather's tools hadn't been about space or practicality. It had been about control, about trying to manage her grief by controlling her environment. She said she'd been angry at Dad for leaving her, angry at my grandfather for dying before she'd really gotten to know him, and angry at me for having connections to both men that she'd never shared. She apologized then, not for the inconvenience or the misunderstanding, but for the cruelty. She said she'd known how much those tools meant to me, and she'd thrown them away anyway because she'd been hurting and hadn't cared about anyone else's pain. I listened to her apology, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. But I also felt the weight of months of dismissal, of being valued only when I was useful. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but I also told her that some actions had consequences that couldn't be undone. She nodded and said she understood. She told me she wasn't asking for forgiveness or for help with her kitchen. She just wanted me to know that she was sorry and that she finally understood what she'd taken from me. We talked for 2 hours about Dad, about my grandfather, about the family we'd been, and the relationship we might be able to build going forward. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As I was leaving, I looked around her kitchen one more time. The cabinets were a safety hazard, and she couldn't afford to fix them properly. But that wasn't my problem to solve. She'd made her choice 6 months ago, and now she was living with the consequences. I told her to be careful in her kitchen, to maybe consider eating out more often until she could get the cabinets fixed. She smiled sadly and said she would. I drove home thinking about my grandfather's hands, about the skills he'd taught me, about the tools that had connected us across generations. Mom had thrown away the physical objects, but she hadn't been able to throw away the knowledge, the muscle memory, the satisfaction of creating something with my own hands. I'd rebuilt my workshop, replaced my tools, and proven to myself that I could indeed build things. The revenge had been satisfying, but it had also been hollow. In the end, the best revenge had been living well, creating beautiful things, and refusing to let her dismissal define my worth. Mom still calls occasionally, and we're slowly rebuilding our relationship. She never asks about her kitchen anymore, and I never offer to help. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. But sometimes, you can construct something new in their place, something different, but maybe stronger for having been tested. I'm working on a rocking chair now, using techniques my grandfather taught me 20 years ago. Every cut, every joint, every smooth stroke of the plane reminds me that some things can't be thrown away, no matter how much space they take up. The tools were just metal and wood, but the skills, the knowledge, the connection to something larger than myself, those live in my hands, in my memory, in every project I complete. And that's something no one can ever take away from me again.